Lefty Grove very well might have been the best left-handed pitcher of all time. But there's one thing that is for certain. He certainly played on the best minor league baseball club of all time. Now, we could spend hours debating that topic, who the greatest left-handed pitcher of all time is. Was Lefty Grove the best? Was Sandy Koufax the best? Was it Randy Johnson? What about Steve Carlton? What about Clayton Kershaw? However, Lefty Grove did something that none of those other men did. Lefty Grove played for Jack Dunn. Jack Dunn really was a man from another era. Dunn was the famous owner of the independent Baltimore Orioles in the 1910s and the 1920s. Dunn is the man who discovered Babe Ruth. Jack Dunn was frustrated in his career by financial misfortune. That misfortune largely stemmed from the Federal League placing a team in Baltimore, the Baltimore Terrapins. As a result, Dunn wound up having to sell the Babe for $10,000 to Boston back in 1915. Now, Jack Dunn never wanted to sell a great player that cheaply again, and boy, he made sure it didn't happen. Now, minor league baseball in those days was different. I mean, a lot different. Independent teams were the norm back then, not the exception. Well, I guess they were sort of independent. The Baltimore Orioles were the most famous independent team, and they were famous because Dunn simply refused to sell his stars. Jack Dunn fought bravely against efforts to impose a draft on the International League. Now, he had selfish reasons. Such a draft would have meant losing his best players for $5,000 each. He knew that they were worth more, and he knew that he could finance his entire organization on the sale of star players if needed. Back in those days, the truth is that most minor league teams had informal relationships with major league teams, and this practice went back at least to the late 19th century and probably earlier. It's kind of hard to do the research on this since, for the most part, they deliberately avoided leaving any kind of paper trail, but the relationship was certainly there. And it's easy to understand why. Minor league teams back then couldn't always rely on selling their best players to the majors for a huge profit. Sometimes it was easier to have a special relationship with a certain team. You can imagine how this works. You give me your best youngster on loan to develop for a while, and I'll let you have my star player at a discounted price. Now, Ban Johnson was not very happy with the thought of such a relationship when he took over the Western League back in the mid-1890s. Of course, breaking free of that type of agreement was tantamount to declaring war on the establishment, a step that Ban Johnson eventually took in 1900. Anyway, as you can imagine, Jack Dunn wasn't exactly popular among the major league owners. Connie Mack maintained a strong relationship with Dunn, but Mack was really the only one. Jack Dunn's Baltimore Oriole dynasty began around 1919. The Orioles played in the old International League, which was the strongest minor league in the United States at the time. You've probably heard stories of the Pacific Coast League in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. You know these stories. It's about the independent league that threatened to gain major league status for itself before the Dodgers and Giants finally moved west. Well, the International League in the early 1920s was everything that the PCL would later be and more. As I told you before, Lefty Grove was discovered playing in Martinsburg, West Virginia back in early 1920. What I neglected to report is that he was discovered by Jack Dunn Jr., who was the only child of Jack Dunn, the owner. Now, Jack Jr. was 25 when he discovered Grove. 3 years later, in 1923, Jack Jr. suddenly passed away, and that sent Jack Dunn Sr. into a deep depression. Dunn stepped away from the day-to-day management of his ball club for a time as he mourned the death of his only child. According to the reports I've seen, Dunn's time away continued for a few months into the 1923 season. But even without their beloved owner, the Orioles were still a team on fire. Now, the part that will really surprise you is that Lefty Grove was not the opening day starter for the Baltimore Orioles in 1923. That was Jack Ogden. Jack Ogden. So his brother Warren Ogden, whose nickname was Curly, was pitching in the American League at that time, first for the Philadelphia Athletics and then for the Washington Senators. Jack pitched in the International League and was one of the aces on a team that was really loaded with incredible pitching. But we're not here to talk about Jack Ogden, we'll talk about him later. Today we're here to talk about Lefty Grove. Grove started the second game of the 1923 season. The Orioles hosted the Syracuse Stars during their first series of the season. Grove's first start of the season came on April 19, 1923. It was in front of what was probably a fairly small crowd at Old Oriole Park. Now, Oriole Park the day before had sat about 7,000 people for opening days. I'm guessing this one it was probably 2,000-3,000. The papers didn't report the attendance. Oriole Park, of course, was once the home of Jack Dunn's Federal League nemesis. Now, Syracuse is interesting. By the start of 1923, Syracuse was chiefly owned by Branch Rickey and the St. Louis Cardinals. The Stars were among the first team that Rickey pulled into his minor league farm system. We take all of this for granted these days with our farm systems, but back in the 1920s, this was new and unusual. In fact, the St. Louis Cardinals were running afoul of official rules at the time by maintaining a team in the high minors as a farm for their own players. There was always the threat that the office of the commissioner would intervene and declare the St. Louis players free agents. In fact, Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis did intervene from time to time. His most famous intervention came in March 1938, when he made 74 Cardinals minor league players free agents at once. We tend to forget about the battle over the minor leagues. The system we've grown accustomed to is an imperial system. It's one that closely resembles the European colonies of old, but that is a topic for another day. Now, when you look at this roster of the Syracuse Stars, you can clearly see the impact that the farm system had. The most readily recognizable name on the roster is Les Bell, who played for the Cardinals and the Cubs in the late 20s and early 30s. Jean Dubuc, who played in Cincinnati briefly and then for Detroit, was an outfielder for the Stars in his mid-30s. He was a pitcher, by the way, in his major league career. Wadey Holm played with the Cardinals during the mid and late 1920s, though he was really never a great offensive threat. Charlie Niebergall was a catcher with the Cardinals very briefly. And that's really it. I mean, the rest of these players either stayed in the minor leagues for their whole career or occasionally made like a cup of coffee performance in the majors. Now, that fact might somewhat taint what Grove ended up doing. So, on that afternoon, April 19th, 1923, Lefty Grove had one of the best games of his career. He struck out a lot of batters. I mean, he usually struck out a lot of batters. They say that he kept a diary in which he'd record the number of strikeouts he tallied up after every game. But he needed a lot of tallies this time. Lefty Grove struck out 17 Stars. That set a new International League record. In fact, the newspapers reported that he was close to setting an all-time organized baseball record. The old record was apparently 19, which was held by a pitcher for Providence named Sweeney and was set in 1884. Now, the interesting thing here is not just the record. I mean, it's interesting, of course, to know about the hidden exploits of Lefty Grove. But no, the interesting thing here is that the competition might not have exactly been fair. Based on my research, the Syracuse Stars were the only farm team in the 1923 International League. They didn't finish in last place, but they also weren't necessarily competing on the same level as every other team. And there's one other component that we always forget about baseball in this era: the shadows. This game started at 3:45 p.m. That's right, baseball in those days tended to start around 3:30 p.m. local time. It makes sense, right? Because your fans are all at work. You're not going to play in front of an empty park. They were there to make money. In fact, if you go back to 1908, you see times as late as 4 o'clock or even 4:30 in places like New York. And remember, back then there were no lights. Now, the Baltimore Sun reports that the sun would set at 6:47 p.m. that day, April 19th, 1920. That seems about right. Remember, there was no daylight savings in 1923. This game lasted about 2.5 hours, which was long for those days. Now, you've got to figure there wasn't too much light left when it ended around 6 o'clock. Now, Lefty Grove was a wild pitcher back in his young days. How would you like to try to hit against a young, somewhat wild fireball pitcher with no batting helmet, no armor, and poor lighting? Geez, no wonder he struck out so many. Now, the end of this story is a little bit sad. Jack Dunn, that defiant supporter of the independent minor leagues, finally relented after the International League became part of the draft in 1925. The Oriole dynasty fell apart in 1926. Jack Dunn Sr. passed away of a heart attack in 1928. That was due in part to a coronary condition that started back in 1923 when his son died. Unfortunately, today the old Orioles are mostly forgotten, except for weird people like me. Most people don't know that there was a team in Baltimore called the Orioles before the St. Louis Browns. Some people who know their history will say, well, the Yankees were originally the Baltimore Orioles, but they forget about the minor league history from 1903 to 1952. But there are some great stories here that really should not go forgotten. The truth is that we've only touched the tip of the iceberg, and we have a lot more to come, so stay tuned.